When Finland joined NATO in 2023, it slammed the door on any hope of keeping things cool with Russia. And now, Finland's handed over 15 military bases to the US, including a top-secret Arctic facility on Russia's doorstep. This move isn't just bold, it's a game-changer. With NATO forces now closer to Moscow than ever before, tensions are boiling over. Is this the start of something much bigger? And how did Finland go from neutrality to becoming one of Russia's biggest threats? Let's dive into the history, the moves, and what this all means for the future. The tension between Finland and Russia isn't new. It's been boiling over for more than a century. Wars, invasions, and shifting borders have scarred their relationship, setting the stage for the icy standoff we see today. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to where it all began. The region that is today under Finland's control has repeatedly swapped ownership, particularly between the Danish, Swedish, and Russian rulers. The Grand Duchy of Finland proclaimed its independence from the Russian Empire during the October Revolution in 1917. Between the two world wars, Finland maintained a tenuous relationship with the Soviet Union, largely due to radical branches of the population aiming to make parts of Karelia, a region shared between the two countries, join as a fully fledged territory under either Soviet or Finnish control. When World War II started, Finland was assigned to be under the Soviet sphere of influence to prevent aggression between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union requested Finland and other Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, to create and supply military bases on their soil for Soviet soldiers in use. But all the countries refused these requests, and the Soviet Union eventually invaded all of them. While the Baltic states lost their independence and were incorporated into the Union, Finland was a much tougher country to subjugate. The war between Finland and the Soviet Union eventually led to the Soviet Union reaching and occupying the area around the city of Vyborg. With progress in the war being negligible from then on, Finland agreed to cede roughly 10% of its territory, which contained Vyborg, then the fourth largest city of Finland, to the Soviet Union. Finland restarted the war with the Soviet Union in 1941, which lasted until 1944, and allowed it to occupy the entire Karelian region. However, when the Soviet Union brought its full force back to the region, the war was ultimately won by the Soviets, affirming the ceded territories and forcing Finland into another war against Nazi Germany to remove its military presence from the region. The goal of the Soviet Union in conquering Finland, at least piece by piece, becomes relatively obvious when you realize the demographics and resource requirements of the large nation. The country's second largest city, St. Petersburg, was located just a few miles out of the border between Finland and the Soviet Union pre-World War II. The Union considered the proximity of another country to a city a severe security issue, hence the need to grab more land around it. The territory ceded by Finland included an area that spanned miles between the two countries, which the Soviet Union quickly started repopulating with their citizens and heavily militarizing. After World War II, the Finnish territory was practically stripped of its Finnish roots and turned into a military buffer zone, effectively preventing either side from gaining entry to the other. With Finland losing one of its largest cities, you might think that there's significant public pressure and political movements to get back their lost territories. However, that's not quite the case. As the Finns were forcibly relocated to other regions of Finland, the city of Vyborg has very little in common with its Finnish and Karelian history. With a negligible number of Karelians left in the area, Helsinki has not raised the possibility of asking Russia to cede the territory back. Unofficial reports from 1991 indicated that the then Russian President Yeltsin proposed selling the territory to Finland to fix the Russian Federation's economic issues after the fall of the Soviet Union. But the idea was never seriously considered, and there's no record of the Finnish government being aware of the proposal at the time. As such, Finland took its losses during World War II in its stride and tried to remain neutral to both the Soviet Union and its successor state to its east, as well as the growing NATO defense alliance to its west. This brings us to the 21st century and the growing threat of Russian aggression. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, there was growing sentiment in NATO and its neighbors that Russia might be trying to expand its territory to extend to the reaches of the former Soviet Union. While the Baltic states were relatively safe from this as they joined NATO back in 2004, only a dozen years after their independence, Finland didn't seek NATO membership at that point. But the Russian special military operation in Ukraine all but confirmed these fears, and NATO quickly came to Ukraine's support. Finland itself started sending military and economic aid from the outset of the war to the tune of an estimated 3.1 billion euros or $3.27 billion up until now. But 2023 was a momentous year for Finland, as the country finally joined NATO in April. Russia immediately condemned the act, claiming that NATO's expansion toward the Russian border was yet another attempt of the West to force its influence and geopolitics onto Russia. Additionally, Finland has accused Russia of trying to smuggle illegal immigrants from Syria through the Russia-Finnish border in late 2023, further souring the ties between the countries. To counter the immigration, Finland had closed all but its northernmost border crossing with Russia. But there's even more behind the scenes in this situation. This issue was not the first time Russia tried to impose immigrants onto Finland, and also Norway, which has a relatively short border with Russia in the Arctic. Back in 2015, when the Syrian crisis began to deepen, Russia did practically the same thing. That time, however, it was revealed that some of the so-called refugees didn't even come from Syria. Russia had taken Syrian families who had long-term residence permits for the country and forced them to leave through the Russia-Finnish border. It was a prime example of Russia manufacturing problems for other countries and claiming that it was legally doing everything it could, citing that it couldn't deny their right to leave nor prevent border crossings between Russia and Finland in that case. The repeated attempts by Russia to sow discord in Finnish politics, either directly through its invasion of Ukraine, which started back in 2014, or by imposing illegal immigrants in 2015, made Finland lose confidence in the belief that Russia was trying to maintain friendly relations with the state. This was despite repeated statements from the Kremlin that Russia has a time-honored tradition of friendly relations with Finland and no territorial disputes between the countries. The latter is technically true, but only after you realize that Finland taking back Karelia would be a costly endeavor, economically and demographically, which is why it hasn't claimed that territory as its own in the first place. With the invasion of Ukraine, and by joining NATO, Finland has become one of the most pivotal members of the alliance, despite its relatively small population and economy, and there are a few good reasons for that. The first is the aforementioned 15 military bases that have been granted to the US to use freely. Finland has the longest land border with Russia out of any Western state at over 800 miles. In fact, when the country joined NATO, the alliance practically doubled its land border with Russia. This means that in the theoretical conflict between Russia and the alliance, which both parties have been effectively preparing for over the past few years, Finnish territory will be one of the major battlefields through which NATO can ferry its troops. This is due to Kaliningrad and Belarus effectively pincering the Baltic states, making any military bases in that region have a solely defensive purpose. Meanwhile, the Norwegian border with Russia is relatively short and across mountainous terrain, making it infeasible for large-scale operations. This leaves the Polish and Finnish borders as potential front lines in a NATO-Russia war, with Poland and Germany being two of the largest militaries in the European part of NATO, and the US stationing well over 30,000 troops in Germany and 299 in Poland. Reinforcing Finland seems like the obvious next move. Even more importantly, Finland was never fully conquered by the Soviet Union during World War II. This was despite the Soviets having an overwhelming numerical advantage. During the Winter War in 1939–40, Finland suffered around 70,000 casualties, while the Soviet casualties were estimated to be around 350,000. This suggests that the Finnish military has the necessary knowledge and experience to fight in the Arctic and subarctic conditions prevalent in the area. The country's military technology is also largely comparable to that of other NATO states, and its mandatory military service requirements mean that practically all men might need to serve in the country's army for up to a year. According to the Finnish Defense Ministry, roughly 65% of all men aged 30 and below served in the army by 2021, with many of the rest falling under specific exemptions. Still, that leaves Finland as one of the few remaining countries in Europe that has kept mandatory military service, which heavily boosts its reservist numbers. By combining the experience and combat readiness that Finland naturally has due to its history and geography, with the US-provided military equipment and soldiers, Finland is likely going to become practically unassailable to Russia. But this would have likely rung true even if Russia wasn't severely weakened through its repeated failures to occupy Ukraine throughout the ongoing war. As such, the developing military alliance between the US and Finland is likely going to tick off Russia even more. But the latter won't be able to do much about it. With Finland, as with the rest of the Western countries that are already imposing economic sanctions, the only feasible first strike Russia would have against the country would be to use nuclear weapons. However, not only is Finland now under the US and NATO-provided nuclear deterrence, with US logistics supplying near real-time information on ballistic missiles, but if Russia were to exert its nuclear supply on Finland, it wouldn't be able to attack the US, the UK, or France, all of which have nuclear weapons themselves. As such, without devolving into nuclear warfare, Finland has practically made itself as safe as possible from Russia's interference, both through direct conflict and indirectly through politics and illegal immigration. The second and perhaps more impressive reason why Finland has been such a boon to NATO is its ongoing support of Ukraine. Somewhat paradoxically, while Finland has been open about sending more than 25 waves of financial and military support to Ukraine, the country's officials and government have stayed tight-lipped on the actual contents of the aid packages. However, some of the more recent reports from the Finnish defense chief indicate that Finland has been sending more advanced military equipment and weapons to Ukraine, with the primary goal being field testing prototypes in real-life conditions. This is unlike most other NATO donations. Most donations that came from NATO were of relatively old equipment, such as refurbished Soviet-era tanks and artillery, and there were two main reasons for this practice. First, at the start of the war, the Ukrainian military had only Soviet-era weapons and its modernized versions, which largely fared slightly better than their Russian counterparts. This meant that the military was fully trained to use them, and donations of similar equipment would have allowed them to deploy the weapons directly onto the battlefield without the potentially costly need to retrain the forces in the use of the new weapons. Secondly, Russia has frequently claimed that NATO donating more potent and modern weapons would be going against its national security policy, which was so loosely worded as to justify Russia using nuclear weapons in retaliation for perceived threats to Russian territory. As the saber-rattling turned out to be nothing more than empty threats, NATO started giving Ukraine more advanced weapons, but even then, most were developed by the end of the 20th century. For example, the first batch of F-16 aircraft that Ukraine has been asking for since the start of the war was only sent at the beginning of 2024 and required Ukrainian pilots to receive up to 6 months of training before the planes could take flight in August. Even then, the actual aircraft came from combined donations from European countries that already secured deals with the US to be provided with F-35s. As such, the donations were essentially obsolete aircraft that would have been tossed out of the air forces anyway. In contrast, Finland is assumed to be sending more modern equipment as well as exhausting its stockpiles of Soviet-era equipment. The first goes in line with the aforementioned notion that the Finnish defense industry is using Ukraine as a test field for its weapon prototypes, allowing it to develop more effective military equipment. This is particularly noteworthy in that the only real danger to Finland comes from Russia itself, which would be using practically the same weapons and tactics as it currently does in Ukraine. As such, if the prototypes prove to be efficient in Ukraine, the Finnish weapons industry can start exporting this equipment throughout NATO and beyond. By exhausting its Soviet-era supplies, Finland is also making way for more modern weapons, most of which are likely going to come from NATO. This is supported by recent reports of the Finnish Air Force receiving Lockheed Martin F-35s, with the first aircraft, out of the 64 ordered, expected to be delivered by late 2026. Additionally, Finland was one of the few countries that has consistently spent more than 2% of its GDP on national defense. The 2% figure is the NATO guideline that all countries were recommended to follow. However, most of the countries actually spent much less than 2%, at least before the current war in Ukraine. These recommendations might get updated over time, as the Russian threat doesn't seem to be waning anytime soon, especially given that Putin is starting to get desperate enough to call into play his alliance with North Korea, for instance. Regardless, the Finnish Ministry of Defense claims that the nation's military is sufficiently equipped to fight the exact kind of war that's currently going on in Ukraine, one where artillery and drone warfare have proved indispensable. In fact, the country's top commander claims that Finland probably has the most firepower per capita out of all European NATO states. This is bolstered by the fact that Finland has more than 100 self-propelled artillery pieces, which include 39 South Korean-made K9 Thunders, among the most desired guns on the market in terms of artillery. Furthermore, Finland's proclivity towards sending prototypes to Ukraine might be something that pushes its military technology into becoming supremely useful against Russia. While there are no exact details on what kind of prototypes are being delivered to the Donbass front lines, obviously due to the fact that Finland doesn't want to let Russia know its next move, we can possibly infer some of these developments. The country's largest military contractor, Patria, is majority owned by the Finnish government and minority owned by a Norwegian defense group. Primarily, Patria develops vehicles and towed weapon systems, which align perfectly with the fact that mobile weaponry is likely to be key in modern warfare. For example, one of Patria's main exports so far has been its Armored Modular Vehicle, or AMV, which is an 8x8 vehicle platform designed primarily for infantry support. However, the Patria AMV is somewhat unique in its capability to adopt other technologies and weapon systems, allowing military operators to customize the vehicles based on pressing needs. For example, AMVs can be outfitted with more armor systems to serve as mobile command centers, or deployed with an increased armament load to serve as mobile anti-tank mortar systems. The possibility of Patria using the war in Ukraine to further its AMV development is supported by reports that indicate that Ukraine might start producing its own AMVs with Patria's licensing. This indicates that Ukraine might have seen just how useful the modularity of the vehicles was and has decided to spearhead its future development in that direction. Patria's AMV systems are perhaps even more vital in the grander scale of Finland's weapons developments, due to the lessons that the West is learning in the war. The prevalence of drone warfare on Ukraine's side and the overwhelming artillery advantage on Russia's are indicative of the fact that modern weapons need to be long-range or extremely mobile to be effective on the battlefield. On the other hand, towed military systems have proven to be slightly underwhelming. This is likely due to the fact they need significantly longer setup times than self-propelled artillery systems. Additionally, towed military systems, despite their name, aren't extremely mobile, and the artillery apparatus needs to be assembled before shooting and disassembled in the event it needs to be moved. This has made them uniquely unable to conduct shoot and scoot or fire and forget operations. Why is this important? Well, modern surveillance systems, particularly ones that heavily rely on drones and AI technology, are extremely efficient at detecting and triangulating artillery strikes. Whenever artillery fires, there's a large chance that it could be spotted by opposing systems and be fired on in return. The rapidly shortening response times mean that immobile systems are much more likely to be destroyed. Patria seemingly aims to fix that through one of its other standard systems. The company has a 155mm towed artillery platform that is compatible with NATO artillery shells. Furthermore, Patria has added self-mobility into the platform by introducing a separate diesel engine to power the wheelbase. It's possible that Patria is now using the systems together in Ukraine to develop an AMV-mounted, self-propelled 155mm artillery system. This would use the long-range capability of the howitzer and combine it with the mobility and armor of the stock AMV. The system bears similarities to a French self-propelled artillery, which uses an 8x8 truck as the platform. The French design, codenamed Caesar, has already been donated to Ukraine in limited numbers and was reported to have significantly outperformed existing towed howitzers, particularly the US-made M109A6 Paladin and the British towed M777. All of these weapons use similar 155mm howitzers as the main armament, so the flexibility of using a truck, or in Patria's case an AMV, is likely to be the differentiator that makes a more effective design. In the same vein, Patria has donated a few dozen of its armored personnel carriers they have dubbed PACY. In particular, the carriers in Ukraine are the slightly obsolete XA-180 and XA-185 designs, which are likely to be superseded by the XA-200 line, which is currently in development. Battlefield reports indicate that at least a dozen of the vehicles were destroyed or captured by Russia over the course of the war. However, this still provides valuable information to the Finnish military industry. Since the PACY is an unarmed military vehicle, its main benefits lie in armor and the ability to mount an autocannon or a mortar on its rotating turret base. Patria might be using the older systems it's donated to Ukraine as field testing in real-world conditions, which it could then leverage to guide how the XA-200 line is improved. The XA-200 line is vital for Patria, since both Finnish and Swedish armed forces use the models. Additionally, the Swedish XA-202s were supposed to have been shipped back to Finland in early 2022 for upgrades and lifespan improvement. Shortly after that, the war in Ukraine began, and Finland sent some of its stock of XA-180s to the front. With the upgrades slated to take until at least 2025, it's likely that Finland is waiting on the results from both the XA-180 and AMV testing to finalize the possible upgrades for the more modern military carrier designs. Finally, in late October 2024, Patria announced the new 120mm mortar system, named Tremos. The two main talking points of the new Tremos? Well, you guessed it, compatibility with multiple mobile platforms and shorter setup time. The first plays right into Patria's expertise in delivering modular carrier systems in its AMVs and PACY lines, while the second harkens to the lesson that shoot and scoot systems are likely the only ones able to survive a potential counterattack. With the announcement, Patria's first Finnish Tremos systems will be complete in mid-2025, and it's highly likely that Tremos is exactly one of the prototypes that was tested in the war. Furthermore, considering that the war in Ukraine is unlikely to finish before then, it's also possible that the first Tremos system could be delivered directly to Ukraine for unveiling and testing in real-world conditions. With NATO's presence in Finland safeguarding it against direct confrontation with Russia for the foreseeable future, the country's weapons and military industry can use the lessons learned in Ukraine to outfit their national military with the most effective designs to counter a Russian threat. And the fact that the US military can now use Finnish military bases only reinforces the idea that Finland has become increasingly important in global geopolitics, in stark contrast to the country's attempts to stay neutral for decades. And with Finland securing an even more modern weapons system, partially through its native military industry and partially through getting F-35s from the US, the country is likely more than ready to be a key decision-maker on the Arctic and Baltic front of NATO-Russia relations. But what do you think? How will Russia respond to Finnish developments? Thank you for watching, and leave your comments below.